Imagine if you would have to get permission from your band leader to go on a date. You could also only join the band if you're under a certain weight and under 30 years old. This was normal in the 1920s. It was also a time where jazz got its name and became the most popular music of the time, and we saw many more all-female bands on the scene. My name is Vicky O'Neon, I'm a drummer and educator. This and much more coming up.
Vicky O'Neon presents
Drumming Through the Decades. So, we've hit the 1920s, which was the decade known as the Jazz Age or the Roaring Twenties. Prohibition laws were in full effect, and instead of keeping people away from drinking, it made alcohol and partying the cool thing to do. Because it was illegal, it went underground and famous speakeasy venues appeared. These secret underground clubs required passwords to enter and were generally the hippest places in town. The music at these venues was primarily jazz music performed by African Americans, which was already underground music due to the segregation laws in place. The jazz from this era was very danceable, so the speakeasies became popular and exciting places to spend a night out. With national broadcasts on radio from 1922, as well as phonograph records becoming more popular, jazz music could now be consumed by millions of people and rapidly won numerous fans, not only in America, but also in Europe and around the globe. This new technology enabled people to hear new music without physically being in the venue. This is something that we absolutely take for granted today, isn't it? It was difficult, however, to capture drums on the recording technology of the time. With the phonograph, for instance, you would just have a large horn capturing the entire band directly onto a record, which is the main reason why we don't hear a lot of drums on early recordings. So to fit the mix, the drums had to be heavily muffled and played very, very quietly. In early recording sessions, you would have the quieter instruments at the front, your louder instruments towards the back, and at the very, very back, you would have the drummer. And if the drummer hit the bass drum too loud, the needle printing the music to the wax would skip and ruin the whole take. So it was a big risk to bring a drummer to a recording session. So do you know where the term jazz comes from? Dixieland Jazz, which was the style of jazz that was famous at the time, got its name from the music group the original Dixieland Jazz Band, spelled with 2 S's. They made what's been considered the first ever jazz recording in 1917 with the song Dixie Jazz Band One Step. The record became huge all over the United States. A massive influence on jazz was also the blues. The blues became a basis for many developments that would appear throughout jazz history. We'll have a look at the blues later on in this episode. Another influence, especially for the rhythms, was something called second line drumming. The term second line refers to the literal second line of musicians in a marching band playing at a funeral or Mardi Gras celebration. There were usually 2 main drummers in the second line, bass drum and snare drum players. Let's head over to my studio and I'll show you. The early jazz coming from New Orleans was heavily inspired by the second line rhythms, where the drummers would take the straight military rudiments with the heavy 2 feel. So they would now mix this with the syncopated rhythms from ragtime, so they would become more like press rolls, these rudiments. And this created a feel that was easy to dance to, and people absolutely loved it. So early Dixieland jazz was really made for people to dance to. There's a direct connection from the African rhythms like the 3-2 clave, and that's now mixed with the military grooves, and together they create a unique hybrid rhythm. And the principal feeling for this music has a triplet feel, and that's something that's characteristic for African American music and will be for decades. And something that's interesting to point out here is that the original Dixieland Jazz Band were all white musicians, and this was the start of a trend that we would see for decades, where white musicians would take African American music and make it popular and achieve great fame as a result. And in terms of the drum kit, as you can see, we still didn't have the hi-hat, we didn't have toms, we didn't have the ride cymbal, but we had smaller percussion like wood blocks and cowbells, and they were used as so-called fill-ins and effects, and that's actually where the word fill comes from. What made Dixieland jazz unique was that all musicians would actually improvise on top of each other at the same time, rather than having each musician taking a solo in turns, which is something that's very common in jazz music today. Okay, so I'm gonna have a go trying out this early Dixieland jazz on the drum kit. Saw an emergence of female musicians both in the jazz and the blues world. A blues singer named Mama Smith recorded Crazy Blues in 1920, which was so popular it essentially created a whole industry for blues songs recorded by women. The drum kit wasn't really used in blues until the late 30s, and until then blues musicians performed mainly solo with a guitar and used their feet to establish a beat. When they did team up with other musicians, the so-called drummer might have used washboards and other makeshift percussion instruments made from household items. Bessie Smith became the most popular female blues singer in the 1920s, and even now, many decades after her death, she is still considered the Empress of the Blues. The woman who showed Bessie Smith the way and mentored her was Ma Rainey, who was known as the Mother of the Blues. Her first recording, Bow Weevil Blues, was made in 1923, and in the next 5 years she made over 100 recordings. Bessie Smith's first record, Downhearted Blues, was a smash hit that reportedly sold 800,000 copies. She would go on to have great success during the rest of the 20s and become the highest earning black performer in the world by the end of the decade. So let's go back to my studio and I'll show you the basic blues structure. So the blues structure, which you can hear in jazz, rhythm and blues, and rock and roll, is characterized by a specific chord progression, of which the 12-bar blues is the most common, where we have the 1, the 4, and the 5 chord. So for example, if you're in the key of C, C would be your 1 chord, F would be your 4 chord, and G would be your 5 chord. So these 12 bars often consist of an AAB pattern, which means that in the first 4 bars, there's a line that's sung, that's then repeated again in the next 4 bars. There we have the AA, and then in the last 4 bars in the B section, we have a concluding line that is slightly different. And this is usually repeated over and over again. And just like with the jazz, we have an underlying triplet feel in blues. Playing blues today, I would say that the most basic version of doing that is to have triplets on your ride cymbal. 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet. So that's 12 notes in total. So we're playing in 12/8. And then I would add the bass drum on beat 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet. And I would add the snare drum on beat 2 and 4. So it would sound like this, the most basic blues version today. 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet, 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet. You would often also use the cross stick instead on the snare drum, and you can add different variations in the bass drum. So play around with that and see what different variations you can come up with. 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet, 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet. But in the 1920s, this sounded slightly different because we didn't actually have the invention of the ride cymbal yet. And we also didn't have an emphasized backbeat on beat 2 and 4. That comes a little bit later. So I'm actually going to use my fly swatters, my brushes, playing along to Bessie Smith, some early 1920s blues.
I'm a young woman and ain't done running round. I'm a young woman and ain't done running round. Some people call me a hobo, some call me a bum. Nobody knows my name, nobody knows what I've done. I'm as good as any woman in your town.
During this era, we also saw more all-female orchestras, and as bands got more sophisticated, we started to see so-called big bands appear. There were groups like the Parisian Redheads, Lil Hardin's all-girl band, the Harlem Playgirls, and the 12 Vampires. The most famous all-female group from this era was founded by a man named Phil Spitalny, who realized he could reach success by gathering some of America's greatest female musicians. The group had their own radio show, Spitalny's Hour of Charm, which introduced them to thousands of listeners and inspired a whole new generation of women to pick up an instrument. Spitalny's group was so successful that its sound and character became synonymous with all girl bands for years to come. Their drummer, Mary McClanahan, was the world's first female drummer to receive sponsorship from a large drum company. The company was Gretsch, which at the time had the reputation for making the best drum sets in the jazz world. Well done, Gretsch. The Hour of Charm Orchestra was especially popular within the army. The music was played for US servicemen on military bases around the world. The idea was that soldiers would find the music soothing because it was made entirely by women. To play in Phil Spitalny's orchestra, women had to meet all sorts of requirements that had nothing to do with their ability to play music. To be in the orchestra, women had to be in their 20s, have long flowing hair, and weigh less than 120 pounds, which is 54 kilos. They were also not allowed to marry, and they needed permission to go on a date. Ugh. Other, more empowering groups for women at the time was Marian Pankey's Female Orchestra, a pioneering jazz group made up exclusively of black members. The Ingenues was another group led by composer Louis Sorensen. Everyone in the orchestra was a multi-instrumentalist, and they earned great respect as one of the most versatile groups of their day. Their tour setup included 12 baby grand pianos, drums, banjo, accordion, wind and string instruments. Can you imagine lugging that around for next to no pay? We also had Helen Lewis and her all-girl jazz syncopators, who had the chance to perform on a rare phono sound on film, which helped to showcase their talent to a much wider audience.
Making noise, breaking toys.
A few years later, at the end of the 1920s, movies with sound, so-called talkies, became popular, and the silent movie era was very, very quickly over. Thousands of drummers were put out of work literally overnight who had spent the past decade specializing in Foley and sound effects for silent movies and radios. A similar panic actually happened later on in the 1980s when the drum machines came into the picture. But no matter the invention, it never replaced the need for a real drummer. In the next episode, we're going to talk about the evolution of the hi-hat, why it was shameful to end a fill on beat 1, and we're also gonna get to know America's fastest girl drummer. Thank you for watching! What was your favorite part about the 1920s? Comment below and make sure to like and subscribe. See you next time!